I had never thought much about getting lost in the woods. I mean, I knew it could happen. People talk about it, share stories of survival and whatnot, but I always figured it would never happen to me. I'd been hiking enough times, knew how to read a map, had a solid sense of direction. Or so I thought. It all started with a simple weekend trip. I wanted to get away from the usual noise, work, traffic, the endless buzz of the city. So I picked a trail I hadn't hiked before. A friend recommended it to me, saying it was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for some solo time. It was about an hour or so outside the city, just far enough that you could forget about everything. The trail was supposed to loop back around, a few miles out, a few miles in. Not too long, not too short, just right. I packed my backpack the night before. Just the basics. A couple of water bottles, some snacks, a first aid kit, a small flashlight, and of course my phone. I made sure my shoes were sturdy. The weather was perfect for hiking. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. I parked my car at the trailhead, took a deep breath of the fresh air, and hit the trail. The first part was easy. The path was wide, well-marked, and surrounded by dense trees. The kind of trees that made the air smell like earth and pine. It was quiet, peaceful. I loved it. I walked at a comfortable pace, taking in the sights and sounds. Birds were singing. A gentle breeze was rustling the leaves, and everything felt right. But then, after a while, the trail started to change. It got narrower, less defined. The trees grew thicker. The sunlight barely touched the ground anymore. There were a few signs here and there, but they were becoming harder to find. At some point, I glanced at my watch. I'd been walking for nearly 2 hours. That didn't seem right. The loop should have been shorter. I decided to check my phone to see where I was. But that's when I realized I had no signal. It didn't freak me out at first. I thought maybe it was just a dead zone in the woods. No big deal. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more I realized I wasn't seeing the usual trail markers anymore. The path had begun to twist in odd ways. There were no signs, no landmarks that looked familiar. My mind raced as I tried to remember the last clear marker I passed. But I couldn't. Nothing stood out. Everything looked the same. The trees, the ground, the overgrown bushes, they all blended together. I stopped, took a deep breath, and tried to calm myself. I'll just retrace my steps, I thought. I turned around, but nothing looked familiar. The woods stretched out in every direction, a maze of trees and underbrush. I kept walking, hoping to find something, anything, to give me a sense of direction. But the more I walked, the more everything started to look the same. The shadows in the trees felt deeper now, and the air had a chill to it. I checked my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing, just the blank screen. I cursed under my breath. I should have paid more attention to the trail. I thought about calling someone, but I knew there was no service here. That's when I started to panic. I knew I shouldn't panic. I was trained for this. I had the basic survival skills, how to stay calm, how to find water, how to make a shelter if I needed to. But that didn't stop the knot forming in my stomach. I was alone in the woods, and I had no idea where I was. I kept moving, hoping to find something. A clearing, a road, a sign of life. But the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees felt like they were watching me, the branches like fingers reaching down. I looked at my watch again. It had been over 3 hours since I started hiking, and I should have been out by now. I hadn't passed a single person. Not one. Not even a footprint. By now, the sun was starting to set. The sky turned a soft orange, and I knew I needed to find shelter before it got dark. But where? I had no idea. My mind was racing as I thought about what to do. I had a little food, some water, and my flashlight. That was it. I decided to keep moving, to walk through the dark if I had to, but I wasn't going to stay still. I needed to find something, anything. A river, a road, another hiker. There had to be something out here, The darkness came quickly, and with it, the temperature dropped. I could feel the chill in my bones, the kind of cold that starts to seep into your skin, making you shiver uncontrollably. I put on my jacket and kept walking, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a thin thread. I heard something, a sound in the distance. It was faint, but it was there. It was a rustling sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. I stopped walking and listened. It was closer now. Something or someone was moving in the dark. I should have turned around. I should have kept my distance, but curiosity took over. I needed to know what it was, so I moved toward the sound. The rustling stopped. It went completely silent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood still, listening. The silence felt louder than anything I had ever heard. Then I heard it, a low grunt, a breath, deep and raspy. I froze, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I took a step back, my breath shallow. The beam from my flashlight flickered. I cursed again, tapping it against my hand, trying to make it work. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I hide? What if it was another hiker, just as lost as me? Or worse, what if it wasn't? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned and started walking faster, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound behind me started again, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Something was following me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving, my legs aching, my mind spinning with fear. I focused on the beam of light in front of me, moving as quickly as I could through the underbrush. I could still hear it just behind me, just out of sight. The rustling, the breathing. My panic grew. But then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. A light, a house, a cabin. I stumbled toward it, my legs nearly giving out from exhaustion. The light was getting brighter as I approached. I could see the outline of the cabin now, the wooden structure standing against the dark sky. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the door and knocked, desperate. There was no answer. I tried again, harder this time, banging on the door. Finally, the door creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway, his face covered in a thick beard. He looked at me for a moment, then stepped aside, wordlessly letting me in. I didn't care what he looked like, or how strange the whole thing felt. I was safe. I collapsed inside, breathless, my body trembling from both the cold and the adrenaline. The man didn't say anything at first. He just motioned for me to sit by the fire. It felt like hours before I could calm down enough to explain what happened. But I did. And when I was done, he nodded, his face serious. "You got lucky," he said. "A lot of people don't make it out here." I didn't argue. I knew he was right. The woods weren't forgiving. And tonight, I had come dangerously close to not making it out. As I sat by the fire, the warmth creeping into my bones, I realized something. Being lost wasn't just about the fear of the unknown. It was about realizing how fragile everything really is, how quickly everything can change. I didn't need a ghost or a monster or anything supernatural to scare me. The woods themselves were terrifying enough, but I had made it out. I was safe, and that for me was enough. I never thought something as simple as taking a hike would end up being the worst decision of my life. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a quick day trip. Get out of the house, stretch my legs, breathe in some fresh air. It was supposed to be a break from the usual routine. But in the end, it became a nightmare I couldn't escape from. Started off as just another normal morning. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with the essentials, a bottle of water, some granola bars, my phone, and a basic first aid kit. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and not too hot, just a typical autumn day in the woods. I had been on hikes before, though not in this particular area. I knew the basics. Stay on the marked trails, keep track of your time, and always let someone know your plans. But that morning, I didn't bother telling anyone where I was going. I figured I would just keep it casual and not waste anyone's time. After all, how bad could it be? The trail was beautiful, winding through trees that were turning bright shades of orange, red, and yellow. The air had that fresh, crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of birds in the trees was a soft melody in the background. I felt peaceful, almost meditative as I walked deeper into the woods. I passed a few people along the way, mostly couples or small groups of friends, but they were all heading back, already finishing their hikes. I felt a sense of accomplishment as I walked further into the forest, thinking I was getting away from the noise and hassle of life. The path began to narrow, and the trees became denser. It was still manageable, just a quiet, peaceful walk, nothing to worry about. I checked my phone just to make sure I had service, but the signal was weak. I didn't think much of it. I wasn't expecting to make calls out here anyway. But then, a few hours into the hike, I realized something was off. The trail wasn't marked as clearly as it had been earlier. The usual trail markers, yellow or orange blazes on tree trunks, were becoming sparse. I walked further, thinking it would reappear, but it didn't. The woods were quieter now, no more birds or sounds of life, only the rustling of leaves beneath my boots. I took a deep breath and turned around. Surely I could backtrack, right? But that's when I noticed the trees. The way they stood, blocking the sun's rays, made it harder to see anything. The path behind me didn't look the same. The trees seemed to shift positions in a way I didn't remember. I froze, feeling a tightness in my chest. This was when the panic started to creep in. The nagging feeling that I had gotten lost was slowly transforming into a cold, hard truth. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that I had been lost before, on smaller trails, and I always found my way back. But the longer I walked, the more my surroundings started to blend together. The trees all looked the same, their bark rough and gnarled, their branches twisted and reaching out as though they wanted to grab me. Every turn I took led to more of the same, a never-ending sea of trees. The trail markers were gone, and I couldn't even tell which direction I was heading anymore. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I needed to make a decision quickly. I checked my phone again, but there was no service. My heart began to race. I thought about turning back and retracing my steps, but that felt like a futile idea. The woods around me were starting to feel oppressive, almost suffocating. It was as if the forest was closing in on me, each tree a sentinel keeping me trapped. I kept walking, hoping for a sign, anything that would tell me I wasn't completely alone in this place. But nothing, just silence. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much that day. I took out a granola bar and chewed slowly, trying to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I tried to calm myself, the weight of the situation kept pushing down on me. As the sky darkened, I knew I had to make a decision. I could try to camp for the night, but I didn't have the right gear for it. My backpack was light, just enough for a day hike. I wasn't prepared to sleep in the woods, especially with the temperature dropping. The thought of spending the night out here terrified me, but the idea of wandering aimlessly until morning was even worse. So I kept walking. The darkness crept in faster than I expected. It was still a few hours before the sun would fully set, but the thick canopy of trees blocked out most of the fading light. I realized then that I had lost all sense of time. How long had I been walking? An hour? 2? I tried to stay focused, but the shadows between the trees made it hard to see where I was going. It was then that I heard the sound. A faint crackle, almost like a twig breaking underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears. The The wind had died down, so it wasn't just a gust. The sound came again, closer this time. Something or someone was moving through the trees. I felt my pulse quicken. My breath was shallow, my body frozen in place. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I hide? My mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Was it another hiker, a camper, or something else? I didn't know, and I couldn't afford to take any chances. I stayed still, listening, my hand on the handle of my pocket knife. The sound of movement continued, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was circling me. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs breaking beneath heavy footsteps, but there was no voice, no shout to reassure me. My stomach twisted with fear. I backed up slowly, trying to stay quiet. The more I listened, the more I felt like I was being hunted. It wasn't just a passing noise anymore. It felt intentional, like someone or something was tracking me. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept moving, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. I couldn't afford to panic, but every step I took felt heavier than the last. My thoughts swirled. What if it was an animal? A bear? But no, the steps were too controlled. It sounded like a person, but the forest was supposed to be empty. I was far from any known trail. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt my nerves fray. I couldn't let this fear overtake me. I had to keep moving. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root hidden beneath the carpet of leaves. My hand shot out to steady myself, but the sound of the movement, heavy footsteps, came even closer, almost right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was no mistaking it now. Something was following me. I broke into a run, not daring to look back. The forest, which had once been so peaceful, now felt like a maze of threats. Every tree seemed to be closing in, every shadow hiding something waiting to pounce. I was no longer thinking clearly. I just ran, pushing through branches, tripping over rocks, and ignoring the pain in my legs. I needed to escape. But then, through the trees ahead, I saw something, a flash of light, the sudden, unexpected glow of a flashlight. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down, but I aimed straight for it, praying that it was a hiker, a ranger, someone who could help. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a small clearing in the woods, and there, in the center, was a small campfire, flickering weakly in the gathering dark. My heart nearly stopped. How was this possible? Who else was out here? I hesitated, but I couldn't stop now. I ran toward the fire, my breath ragged and loud. My legs burned, and my throat felt dry, but I pushed myself forward. And that's when I saw him, a man sitting by the fire, staring at me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just looked at me with wide, curious eyes. I stopped a few feet away from him, panting, my hands still clutching the knife. My mind was racing. Was he another lost hiker? A rescuer? But then I saw his clothes, worn, dirty, and tattered, and the way his eyes gleamed in the firelight, too wide, too intense. "Are you lost?" he finally asked, his voice rough, almost too calm. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. I didn't trust him, not yet, but I couldn't just stand there in the woods alone. He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin. "Well, you're in luck. I can help you find your way." And for the first time since I had stepped into those woods, I felt a small sliver of hope. I've always enjoyed hiking, the fresh air, the quiet, the sense of freedom when you're alone with nature. It's my escape from everything: work, noise, the pressure of daily life. But what happened that day in the woods changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about nature, and about survival. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, just a few hours up to the ridge, enjoy the view, maybe take some pictures, and head back before it got too late. I've hiked plenty of trails like this one before. Nothing too difficult, nothing too remote. The trail was well marked, and I had all the gear I needed: water, a snack, a map, and a fully charged phone. I'd done this hundreds of times, so I figured it would be no different. But I was wrong. The first mistake I made was something so small, I didn't even realize it was a mistake until much later. I had a tendency to always keep an eye on the trail markers, making sure I was on the right path. This time, though, I was feeling so good, so confident that I didn't pay attention to where the markers were, and I ended up straying from the main trail. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. The woods were beautiful, and I was enjoying the solitude. There was no one else around, just me and the trees. It wasn't until I tried to retrace my steps that I realized something was off. I'd gone too far off the trail, and now I couldn't see any markers. I paused, looked around, and saw nothing but trees. They all looked the same. The path I had followed had slowly disappeared, leaving only the dense forest behind me. I pulled out my map and checked my location. I was sure I wasn't far from the main trail. I'd only walked a little ways off, so I started heading in what I thought was the right direction. But after a while, it became clear that I had no idea where I was anymore. The woods weren't just thick, they were disorienting. I tried using my compass, but I couldn't make sense of it. The trees and the hills all started to blend together in a way I couldn't understand. I was starting to panic, but I told myself to stay calm. I've heard enough survival tips to know that panicking would only make things worse. I kept walking, hoping to see some sign of the trail, but hours passed, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The air was starting to cool down, and the reality of my situation began to settle in. I was lost, really lost, the kind of lost that no map or compass could fix. As the light started fading, I realized I needed to stop and find shelter. I could try to keep walking, but that would only make things worse. If I kept moving without knowing where I was going, I might just end up farther from safety. I needed a plan. First things first, I needed to stay warm. The temperature was dropping fast, and I didn't have much to keep me warm. My jacket was light, and my water bottle was half empty. I was running out of daylight, and panic started to rise in my chest. But I shook it off. Now wasn't the time for panic. I started to look for a place to set up camp. I wasn't expecting to make a fire, but I could at least find some kind of shelter to keep out of the wind. After some searching, I found a small patch of ground near a cluster of trees where I could set up. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being exposed in the open. I collected some dry branches, hoping I could use them to build a small shelter of sorts. I didn't have much in the way of survival gear. A small pocket knife, a lighter, and some rope were about all I had. I worked quickly, gathering as much as I could. My hands were shaking, but I focused all my attention on the task at hand. By the time I finished, the sky had turned dark, and the woods were eerily silent. I didn't have a fire, but I managed to create a makeshift shelter by tying some branches together and covering them with leaves. It wasn't much, but it would keep me out of the wind for the night. The cold was unbearable. I huddled into the small shelter, wrapping my jacket tightly around me, hoping it would provide some warmth. I listened to the night sounds, the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig breaking somewhere in the darkness. But the longer I stayed there, the more I realized how alone I was. Completely alone. I tried not to think about how far I was from help, how far I had wandered from the trail. It had been hours since I last saw any signs of human presence. The whole world seemed to shrink down to just me and the dark woods. The panic kept creeping in, making my chest tight, but I forced myself to focus on staying calm. The night dragged on and I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds that I couldn't explain. The wind? An animal? My mind was playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I felt a small sense of relief. At least I had survived the night, but now I had to figure out how to get back to the trail. I packed up my shelter, and as I was about to set off, I stopped. Something in the air felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood perfectly still, listening. There was no sound of birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Felt wrong, and I didn't know why, but I shook it off and started walking. I don't know how much time passed, but I kept walking, hoping to find something, anything, that would lead me back. But no matter how much I walked, the woods seemed endless. I had no way of knowing if I was moving in the right direction or if I was just making things worse. After hours of walking, I finally stumbled onto a small creek. It wasn't much, but I knew it could be my lifeline. Creeks often lead to larger bodies of water and eventually to civilization. I followed it, carefully making my way along its bank, hoping it would lead me to something, anything. By the time the sun started to set again, I had walked for miles. I was exhausted. My feet ached, my body was sore, and my stomach growled with hunger. I felt like I was at the end of my rope, but something deep inside me kept pushing me to move forward. If I stopped now, I knew I might not make it. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it. The trail. It wasn't much, just a small break in the trees, but it was enough to send a wave of relief crashing over me. I followed it quickly, praying that it would lead me to safety. I had no idea how far I had wandered off the main path, but this was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. When I finally saw the parking lot in the distance, I nearly collapsed. The relief was overwhelming. I had made it. I was out of the woods. I had survived. I don't know how I did it. The whole experience felt like a blur. But I know one thing for sure. That day changed me. It taught me something about myself, about how far I could push myself, and about how easy it is to lose control of things. I've hiked plenty of trails since then, but I'll never forget the time I got lost. It was the closest I've ever come to truly understanding what it means to be alone, to rely on nothing but your instincts and your will to survive. And I'll never take the woods for granted again. I never meant to get lost. I didn't even expect to be in a situation where I would have to rely on survival instincts. But here I was, alone in the woods, with no idea where I was and no easy way out. It all started early in the morning when I decided to take a solo hike. The trailhead was just a short drive from the cabin where I'd been staying for the weekend, nestled on the edge of a quiet national park. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing walk, maybe a few hours out in nature to clear my head. I was no expert hiker, but I'd spent enough time outdoors to think I could handle it. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack and checked my gear. Water bottle? Check. Snacks? Check. Map of the trail? Check. I was set. The sky was overcast, but the weather report said there was no rain expected, so I figured I was in the clear. I had no reason to think I wouldn't be back before the afternoon. I set off down the path, the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt trail the only sound for the first few minutes. The woods around me were thick with tall pines, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was fresh, cool but not cold, and the scent of damp earth filled my lungs as I walked deeper into the forest. There was something peaceful about it, a quiet that settled over me and made me forget about everything else. Work, life, stress. Felt good to just be alone. I followed the trail markers, though they weren't always easy to see. The farther I went, the less defined the path became, until it was more of a suggestion than a clear trail. But I didn't mind. I had my map, and as long as I kept heading west, I was pretty sure I'd eventually reach the lake. At least that's what the map said. As I continued, I started to notice the trail was becoming more rugged. The ground was uneven, and the trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out more and more light. Still, I pressed on. The thought of turning back didn't cross my mind. It was just a hike after all. What could go wrong? But slowly, the small doubts started creeping in. The trail was getting harder to follow. I'd look up and find myself staring at the same group of trees I had passed 5 minutes ago. The landscape around me seemed to blur together, each section of the forest looking almost identical to the last. I checked my map again. It wasn't exactly helping. The terrain didn't match what I saw in front of me, and the markers were few and far between. I had been so confident earlier, but now I began to wonder if I'd missed a turn somewhere. I kept walking, hoping to spot a familiar landmark, but after a while, the air felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, almost oppressive. The breeze had died down, and the forest felt eerily still. It was as if the world had stopped, holding its breath. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over 20 minutes. And when I checked my map again, I couldn't make sense of the terrain anymore. I was off track. The realization hit me hard. I was lost. My heart started to race, but I tried to stay calm. I knew the basics: don't panic, stay put if you're unsure of the way, retrace your steps if possible. I looked around, trying to spot something that would tell me where I was. But everything looked the same. The trees were tall and unyielding, their trunks covered in patches of moss, and the ground beneath my boots was soft, damp from the morning dew. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but there was no clear sign of where I had come from. It all looked like the same endless stretch of trees. I decided to keep moving forward, hoping I'd find something that would give me direction. But as the minutes stretched into hours, I began to realize just how badly I had miscalculated. My water bottle was half empty, and my snacks were barely enough to get me through the morning. I'd made a mistake by not bringing more food or water. I should have known better. The forest felt like it was closing in on me. The shadows seemed deeper, and I noticed how the trees blocked out the sky above me. The sunlight that had been filtering through the leaves was now nearly gone. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves, but the silence in between was suffocating. Every footstep felt like it echoed too loudly in my ears. Every movement seemed to draw attention to my presence. By now, I was seriously worried. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. Felt like the world had forgotten I was even here. The realization that I was truly alone hit me like a physical blow. I had no way to call for help, no way to contact anyone. I could only rely on my instincts, and those instincts were telling me that I was in trouble. The woods were disorienting, and it felt like I was walking in circles. Every time I thought I recognized a landmark or spotted a trail marker, it turned out to be something else entirely. I felt the panic rising in my chest, but I fought it down. Panic would only make things worse. I needed to stay sharp, to think clearly. I found a small clearing and decided to stop for a break. I needed to conserve my energy. I sat down on a fallen log and ate the last of my snacks, some granola bars and a few almonds. My water was running low, and I had no idea how long I'd been walking, but it felt like hours. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew it wouldn't be long before it got dark, and the thought of spending the night out here without any shelter or proper gear was terrifying. But then, just as the first hint of panic started to claw its way back, I heard something. It wasn't much, just a faint sound, but it made me stop. It was the sound of water, a stream. I stood up quickly and followed the sound. If I could find water, I could find my way out. It wasn't long before I came across the stream. It was a small one, barely a trickle, but it was enough to give me hope. Water meant I was near something, maybe a larger river or a trail. I followed the stream for what felt like an eternity. The sound of it rushing in my ears, the feeling of relief growing with every step. I had no idea how much time passed as I walked, but my legs were sore, and I was starting to feel the exhaustion weighing on me. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I would ever find my way out, I saw it. A trail. It was faint, barely visible through the underbrush, but it was a trail. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I followed it with everything I had left. My feet felt like lead, but I pushed on, desperate to get out. The sky had darkened, and the first stars were beginning to appear overhead, but I could see a light in the distance. A campfire. A campfire meant people, and people meant safety. I stumbled toward the light, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I saw a small campsite. There were 2 hikers sitting around a fire, chatting and roasting marshmallows. I must have looked like a ghost to them, disheveled, sweaty, and covered in dirt, but they didn't hesitate. They helped me to their camp, gave me water, and listened as I told them my story. They were friendly and offered to share their food and their shelter for the night. The relief was overwhelming. I had made it. I wasn't lost anymore. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. I was safe. I had made it through the night. The hikers helped me get back to the trailhead, and from there, I found my car. It was a long drive back to the cabin, but I didn't mind. I was grateful to be out of the woods. I learned a lot from that experience. The most important lesson was that nature, while beautiful and peaceful, demands respect. It's easy to feel invincible when you're hiking on well-worn trails, but one wrong turn, one misstep, and you can find yourself lost in an instant. I was lucky, but luck runs out eventually. I knew now that I needed to be more prepared, more aware, and more humble when I went into the wilderness. It wasn't the most fun weekend I'd ever had, but it was certainly one I'd never forget. I'd made it through, and that was something to be proud of. I didn't think I'd get lost. I had been hiking through the forest for years, walking trails that twisted through dense woods, but never did I think I'd end up disoriented in the place I knew so well. It all started with the usual weekend trip. The sky was clear, the air crisp but not too cold, and the forest was peaceful as always. The trees were tall and imposing, but there was something about their quiet presence that always made me feel safe. That day, I was going to hike a new trail I had read about online, one that wasn't too far from the main park entrance. Nothing too dangerous, nothing too remote. Just a little adventure to clear my mind. I parked my car at the small trailhead and gathered my things. My backpack was light, with only essentials: water, snacks, a map of the area, and my phone in case of an emergency. The trail was marked with bright orange signs, hard to miss. I started walking at a steady pace, feeling the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds chirped in the distance, the occasional squirrel darted across the path, and the air smelled like pine. The trail was well maintained, winding through the trees but not too difficult to follow. I was making good time, and I felt comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable. I hadn't checked the map since the start, assuming I knew exactly where I was going. An hour in, I started to notice things weren't as familiar as they should have been. The path became narrower, and the trees grew thicker, their branches reaching overhead like claws. I didn't remember this section of the trail being so dense, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it had just been a while since the last time I hiked here. Then, I saw something strange. A marker, a small orange flag, but it wasn't in the usual spot on a tree or post. This one was tied to a branch that stuck out at an odd angle, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. It made me pause, a slight unease creeping up my spine. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The path was still clear, and I was still heading in the right direction, or so I thought. I kept walking, but the forest seemed to close in around me more and more. The trees grew taller, their trunks more twisted, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in strange ways, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but the silence in the woods felt unnerving. I hadn't seen another person since I started, which was unusual for a popular trail like this one. After another hour, I noticed the trail was starting to split. The main path veered off to the left, while a smaller, less noticeable path ran to the right. I couldn't remember this fork being here, and my mind began to race. Should I stick to the main trail? What if the smaller path was the one I was supposed to take? I decided to stay on the main path, but the feeling of doubt lingered in the back of my mind. I kept walking. The sound of my boots crunching on the leaves was the only noise breaking the heavy silence. But then, just as I was beginning to settle into the rhythm of walking, I noticed something else. The trail markers, the bright orange flags that had been so clear at the beginning, were now sparse. It was as if they had been deliberately removed or were too faint to spot. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any new markers for a while. The path had started to blend into the surrounding forest, and I could barely tell where it went next. My heart started to race as I looked around. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen something familiar. I pulled out the map and checked my location, but the paths didn't seem to line up with the map's markings. Panic surged through me. I'd gotten lost. I was alone, deep in the woods, and I had no idea how to get back. My stomach dropped, and I tried to steady my breathing. I wasn't going to panic. I had hiked enough to know what to do. I would backtrack. I'd find the main trail again. I just had to focus. I turned around, retracing my steps, but the trees all looked the same. The path was disappearing behind me, and I couldn't even be sure if I was headed in the right direction. I kept walking, the forest closing in around me, until I found myself standing in a small clearing with no path in sight. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The forest that had felt so peaceful earlier now seemed dark and suffocating. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars. I tried to call, but the screen flashed no service. My heart raced again. I couldn't rely on my phone. Not here. I had to trust my instincts. I kept moving, hoping to find something that would point me back to the main trail. I passed through dense thickets, the ground soft and muddy beneath my boots. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest had taken on an entirely different feel. It was darker, quieter. The familiar noises of the woods, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals, had all stopped. It was just me, alone, and the sound of my own breath. The cold set in quickly as the light faded. I was beginning to feel the weight of my situation. If I didn't find my way out soon, I might be stuck here overnight. I couldn't risk that. I had to stay calm and focused. I took a deep breath and scanned the forest around me. The trees were taller here, their branches intertwining high above. I couldn't see the sky anymore, just dark shapes looming overhead. I needed to make a decision. I could try to head west, back the way I thought I came from, or I could risk going off the trail in search of something, anything that might lead me back to safety. I chose to head west. I pushed through the underbrush, each step harder than the last as the ground grew rougher and less forgiving. I couldn't see my feet anymore, but I kept going, putting one foot in front of the other. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the branches. The darkening sky felt heavy, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as the panic was about to overtake me, I saw it, a break in the trees, a glimpse of light. It was faint, but it was there. I ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks, not caring about the pain or the exhaustion. The light grew brighter as I got closer, until I broke through the last line of trees and found myself standing on a small dirt road. I stopped and took a deep breath, the relief flooding through me. The road was empty, but I could hear the distant sound of a car engine. I was out. I had made it. Took me another half hour to walk back to the trailhead, but I didn't care. I had survived. I had been lost, but I had found my way out. By the time I reached my car, the sky was completely dark. I sat for a moment, just breathing. The forest, which had seemed so comforting at first, was now something else. Something I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I had learned something today. The woods can be beautiful, but they can also be deceiving. And no matter how well you think you know a place, it can always turn on you. But I was safe. I was alive, and I wouldn't be returning to that trail anytime soon. It started as just another day in the forest. I had been hiking alone for a couple of days, enjoying the fresh air and the peace of being away from everything. I had planned to do a short solo hike to the overlook that I'd heard so much about. The trail seemed easy enough, nothing too intense, but that's the thing about the woods. They can trick you if you're not careful. I set out in the morning, carrying only my essentials. A small backpack with water, some snacks, my map, and my phone. I didn't really expect to use my phone for anything other than checking the time or snapping a few pictures. I'm not one to get lost. I've hiked these woods before, so I figured I knew the area well enough. But that morning, I made the mistake of straying from the main trail. It started innocently. The trail forked a bit, and there was a smaller path to the right that looked like it could lead somewhere interesting. I was curious. Why not? I had time. Besides, I could always just turn back if I didn't like where it was going. I told myself that over and over as I walked deeper into the unfamiliar woods. The first hour was beautiful, peaceful, even. The sun filtered through the trees, and I could hear birds chirping in the distance. The trail was mostly dirt, with occasional rocks and roots sticking up through the soil. I moved quickly, enjoying the solitude and the sense of freedom that comes with being alone in nature. But after a while, things started to feel different. The woods grew quieter, and the path began to narrow. I looked around, trying to spot the trail markers, but there was nothing. No signs, no arrows, nothing that told me I was still on track. The trees were thicker here, the underbrush denser. The air felt heavier, as though something was closing in around me. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out where I was. I pulled out my map and studied it closely, but everything seemed off. The trail I was on didn't match up with anything on the map. That's when the panic set in. I'd gone too far. The path had curved in a way that I didn't remember, and now I was surrounded by nothing but trees in every direction. I tried retracing my steps, but when I looked back, the trail behind me seemed different, as though it had changed since I last walked on it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. There was no reason to panic yet. It wasn't like I was lost, just a little off course. I kept walking, hoping the trail would open up again, but it didn't. The trees just kept getting thicker, the ground muddier, and the light seemed to fade despite it being midday. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Nothing. Not even a faint bar. That was when I really started to feel the weight of the situation. I wasn't just off track anymore. I was lost. I tried to keep my cool, telling myself that if I just kept moving in one direction, I would eventually find my way back. But after what felt like hours of walking, nothing looked familiar. The landscape had completely changed, and my thoughts started to race. What if I didn't find my way out? What if I ran out of food or water? What if the night came and I wasn't ready? I was still trying to figure out my next move when I heard something in the distance. It was a rustling sound, like something large moving through the trees. I froze. For a second, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but I quickly realized it wasn't that. The sound was rhythmic and it was getting closer. My heart started pounding. My mind began to race through all the possibilities. None of them good. I stepped off the trail and ducked behind a tree, holding my breath. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be seen. The sound grew louder, and I could hear branches cracking under the weight of something heavy. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I waited in the silence for what felt like forever before cautiously stepping out from my hiding place. It was quiet again, too quiet. I slowly walked forward, trying to stay as calm as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig under my feet made my heart skip a beat. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the uncertainty of being lost, but my nerves were shot. By now, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I realized I had to make a decision. If I didn't turn back now, I would be stuck in the woods overnight. I had no idea where I was, but I had to try and find my way back to the main trail before it got dark. I started walking in what I thought was the direction I had come from, but the trees looked the same. Every direction seemed the same. I stopped again to check the map, but it was no use. It didn't matter how many times I looked at it. I was lost. Hours passed, and the light continued to fade. The air grew colder, and I realized I hadn't eaten or drunk anything for a while. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I needed to focus. I needed to find shelter before the night fully set in. The next few hours were a blur. I walked and walked, my feet growing sore, my mind growing foggier with each step. I could feel the cold creeping in, and the trees around me felt more oppressive, like they were closing in. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a branch underfoot sent my heart racing. But there was no turning back. I couldn't stop now. If I didn't find shelter soon, I would be in real trouble. Eventually, I spotted something in the distance, a break in the trees. My heart leaped in my chest. I rushed toward it, praying it wasn't just another illusion. As I got closer, I realized it was a small clearing. Not much, but it was something. A place where I could rest, maybe even light a fire. I quickly got to work gathering dry wood from the surrounding trees. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold the kindling as I tried to arrange it in a small pile. The lighter in my pocket felt heavy, but I managed to get a spark going. The fire was small at first, but it was enough to give me some hope. The warmth of the flames was a small comfort in the growing cold of the night. I huddled close to the fire, my mind racing through all the things I should have done differently. I shouldn't have strayed from the main trail. I shouldn't have ignored the signs that something was off. But it was too late for regret. I could only focus on getting through the night. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I realized something. I wasn't just lost in the woods. I had to trust myself. I had to believe that if I kept calm and kept moving forward, I could find my way out. I couldn't panic. I couldn't let the fear take over. I sat by the fire, wrapping my arms around my knees for warmth, watching the flames flicker in the dark. The hours passed slowly, but eventually, as the night stretched on, I closed my eyes for a few minutes of rest. I was exhausted, my body aching, but I knew I couldn't sleep for long. If I did, I might miss something important. The fire eventually burned down to embers, and I forced myself to get up. The cold was unbearable, but I couldn't just sit there. I needed to move. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, I was already walking again. I had no real direction in mind, but I figured I couldn't stay put. The woods looked different in the light of day, and I noticed things I hadn't seen before. The way the trees bent, the way the ground sloped. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was still racing. The only thing I could do was keep walking, keep moving, and hope I would find the way out. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky, and I began to feel a sense of relief. The woods no longer felt as oppressive. I could see clearer now. I stopped and looked around, trying to make sense of everything. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The main trail. Couldn't believe it. It was barely visible through the trees, but it was there. I rushed toward it, my legs aching, my body weak from the exhaustion of the last day and night. When I finally stepped onto the trail, I couldn't stop myself from smiling. It was a small, simple thing, but in that moment, it meant everything. I had made it out. I walked the rest of the way back to the parking lot, where my car was parked. The sun was high in the sky now, and I was grateful. I didn't need to look back anymore. I had survived. The wind had been picking up for hours. At first, it felt refreshing, but now it was starting to cut through my jacket, biting at my skin like it had a purpose. The tall trees around me stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind, and their leaves rustling with every gust. I'd taken this hike up the mountain to clear my head, to get away from the noise of daily life. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized how little I had prepared for being out here in the dark. I had no intention of getting lost. I was supposed to follow the trail and head back down to my car before nightfall. But somewhere, when I was focused on my thoughts, I took a wrong turn. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. I'd been on plenty of hikes before, and I knew the woods well enough to handle a small detour. But the more I walked, the less familiar things felt. It wasn't like I was deep into some uncharted part of the woods, but the paths were becoming harder to distinguish. The faint markings on trees that had been reassuring earlier were becoming harder to find, almost as if they were disappearing altogether. The ground beneath my boots had started to change, the soil softening into uneven, muddy patches, and my steps were more cautious as I made my way through the woods. I checked my watch. It was just past 5 p.m. I'd be fine, I thought. I still had a couple of hours of daylight left. I could find my way back if I retraced my steps, no problem. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the usual sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small creatures, had fallen silent. It was an eerie quiet, the kind that makes you think something's off, but you can't quite place what. I stopped for a moment trying to get my bearings. I didn't recognize any of the trees around me. The map I had brought with me seemed useless now. I pulled it out and tried to look at it, but the details on the paper didn't match up with anything I was seeing. The trail I was on didn't show up anywhere. It was like I had walked into a part of the woods that wasn't on any map. Frustration built up inside me. I had to keep moving, I thought. It was stupid to stand still, especially with the daylight running out. I wasn't scared yet, just annoyed. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but after a few minutes, it became clear that I wasn't going to be able to find my way back. I had no idea which direction I'd come from, and everything around me started to look the same. My heart rate picked up a little as I realized just how alone I was out here. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but of course, there was nothing. No bars, no GPS, nothing. I couldn't even text someone to let them know where I was. My stomach churned with anxiety. I needed to stay calm. I knew that. Panicking wouldn't help. So, I took a deep breath and tried to remember the basic survival tips I'd learned over the years. Find water, find shelter, and keep moving in a straight line. If I could find a road or another trail, I'd be fine. I just had to stay focused. The next hour felt like it stretched into infinity. The daylight continued to fade, and the woods around me became darker and more oppressive. I stumbled through the thick underbrush, trying to find any sign of a trail, but it was all unfamiliar terrain. The air was getting colder, and I regretted not bringing more layers with me. The wind howled through the trees, sending leaves swirling around me like some kind of twisted dance. I could feel the darkness creeping in, and I didn't want to be out there when it completely consumed the forest. I needed to find shelter. As much as I hated the idea of staying still, I knew I couldn't keep walking forever. My energy was draining, and I could feel the exhaustion setting in. Eventually, I spotted a small, hollowed-out tree stump up ahead. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter from the wind. I crouched down inside it, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible, though the ground was damp and cold. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to conserve heat. The wind picked up even more, howling through the trees like a living thing. I heard it whistling and moaning, almost like the forest itself was alive, trying to push me out. But I held my ground. I wasn't about to let the woods get the better of me. It wasn't long before I realized how uncomfortable I was. My muscles ached from walking for hours, and the cold was seeping into my bones. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, and I tried to remind myself that I wasn't in any immediate danger. I had food and water, and I could always build a fire if I needed to. But the deeper the night grew, the more unsettling the sounds around me became. I heard branches snapping in the distance, twigs crunching underfoot, but I couldn't tell if they were from an animal or something else. Every rustle of leaves sent my nerves on edge. The cold wasn't the only thing making me shiver now. I decided that I couldn't stay in the stump any longer. It wasn't enough to keep the cold out, and the noises around me were getting worse. I needed to move. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving forward. I stood up and began walking again, every step slow and deliberate. The wind was relentless now, biting at my face, but I couldn't stop. I kept my head down, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. The sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor was the only thing I could hear, and it gave me a small sense of comfort. At least I wasn't completely alone out here. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed something in the distance. A faint light. It flickered through the trees like a beacon in the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. But then it came again, a brief, steady glow cutting through the trees. It had to be a campfire. Someone else had to be out here. I didn't even hesitate. I pushed myself forward, stumbling through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and soon I could make out the shape of a small campfire surrounded by rocks. There was a small tent nearby, and I could hear the crackling of the fire as it burned. I stepped into the clearing, and I could feel the warmth of the fire hit me like a wave. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, and I was so relieved to see someone else. Person sitting by the fire, alone. "Are you okay?" the man asked when he saw me. He had a rugged look, his clothes a little worn, but he didn't seem surprised to see me. Maybe he had been expecting someone, or maybe it was just that he was used to people getting lost in these woods. "I'm lost," I said, my voice shaky. "I've been out here for hours. I can't find my way back to the trail." The man nodded. "Happens more often than you think. The woods can be tricky." He gestured to the fire. "Sit down. Warm up." I didn't need to be told twice. I sank down beside the fire, letting the heat wash over me. It felt like it had been forever since I'd felt anything like warmth. I closed my eyes for a moment, just taking in the relief of being around another person, in a safe place. "We'll figure out how to get you back tomorrow," the man said. "You're not the first to get turned around." I nodded, grateful but exhausted. I could finally relax. Tomorrow we would figure out how to get back. For now, though, I was safe, and that was enough. I never thought I would get lost in the woods. People always talk about getting lost, but I assumed it was something that happened to other people, not me. I had been hiking before plenty of times, and I knew the trails. This time, though, everything was different. What started as a simple day hike turned into something I'll never forget. It was a chilly morning in late fall when I decided to take a quick solo hike through a part of the forest I hadn't explored before. The air was crisp, and the trees had started shedding their leaves, painting the ground in shades of red, yellow, and brown. I was feeling good that day, energized by the fresh air and the quiet solitude of the forest. I had packed lightly, just a backpack with water, a couple of granola bars, a small first aid kit, and a jacket. The trail I chose was supposed to be a well-marked path that looped back to the main trailhead in a few hours. I had checked my map before setting out, making sure everything seemed straightforward. No big deal. I set out on my hike around 9 a.m., with the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The further I walked, the more I found myself drawn into the quiet. The sounds of birds calling and leaves crunching underfoot were soothing, and for a while, everything felt perfect. But then, I made my first mistake. I got distracted by the beauty of the forest. I came across a small creek, its water running clear and fast over the rocks. I stopped to take a break, sat down on a large stone, and let the peaceful sound of the water fill the air. I lost track of time, enjoying the moment far more than I should have. When I stood up and looked around, I realized that I didn't recognize the path. I had been on the main trail when I first stopped, but somehow I had wandered off to the side without noticing. The trees were dense here, and the small creek I had followed was not visible from the main path. I checked my map again, but it didn't help much. There were no clear markers, and the trail seemed to have disappeared into a tangle of underbrush. At first, I wasn't too worried. I thought, it's just a little detour. I'll find my way back. I retraced my steps, thinking I could just follow the creek back to the main trail. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The forest was eerily quiet now, and the sound of the creek had faded. I tried looking for any familiar landmarks, but everything seemed to look the same. The trees were tall and thick, and the underbrush was dense, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me. The sunlight started to fade as the hours passed, and I realized I hadn't seen another person in what felt like forever. My stomach began to tighten with anxiety, but I pushed the feeling aside. Stay calm, I told myself. You'll be fine. Just keep moving. But I wasn't fine. I could feel the panic creeping up inside of me as I realized that I had no idea where I was anymore. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. That's when the true weight of the situation hit me. The feeling of isolation began to set in. I wasn't just a little lost. I was deep in the woods, with no way to communicate or get help. I was alone. The temperature started dropping as the sun set, and I began to realize that I had no real plan. I wasn't prepared for an overnight stay in the woods. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing. I still had water, but I didn't want to waste it. I had a small flashlight in my bag, but it wasn't enough to navigate through the dark forest. I had to make a decision. Keep walking or try to find a place to wait until morning. After a few more hours of walking and seeing no signs of the trail, I decided that finding shelter was my best bet. I needed to stay warm and conserve my energy. The temperature was dropping quickly, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck out in the open all night, exposed to the cold. I found a small clearing near a cluster of trees. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. I cleared away some leaves and built a makeshift shelter using fallen branches. It wasn't much, but it provided some cover from the wind. I wrapped my jacket tightly around myself and sat down, trying to make myself comfortable. As the night wore on, the cold became unbearable. I tried to sleep, but it was hard to find rest when every little noise in the dark made my heart race. The wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig made me jump. The hours dragged on, and eventually, I fell into an exhausted, fitful sleep. I woke up several times during the night, each time more disoriented and cold. By the time morning came, I was shivering uncontrollably. I knew I had to keep moving. I packed up my makeshift shelter and set out again, determined to find my way back. My energy was running low, and my legs felt like lead, but I kept pushing forward. I tried not to think too much about how alone I was. I didn't have any choice but to keep going. By the time the sun had fully risen, I had lost track of how long I had been walking. Hours? Days? My stomach growled in protest, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much the day before. I reached into my bag for a granola bar and ate it quickly, not caring about savoring the taste. I was just trying to keep myself going. That's when I saw it. A trail marker, barely visible through the dense trees. I almost didn't believe it at first. I had been so convinced I was completely lost that I had stopped looking for markers. But there it was, a small, faded sign nailed to a tree. I followed it, moving as quickly as I could. My legs were sore, my feet ached, and I was exhausted. But that sign gave me the boost I needed. I kept walking, scanning the trees for any more markers. After what felt like forever, I finally saw another trail sign, and then another. The familiar feeling of the trail came back, and my hope began to rise. I was getting closer. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for any signs of the main trail. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. I didn't recognize it immediately, but as I looked closer, I saw a small wooden bench near the path. It was a spot I had passed earlier in the hike. I felt a wave of relief flood over me as I realized I was back on the main trail. Couldn't believe it. I had made it. The walk back to the trailhead felt like a blur. My mind was focused on one thing: getting out of the woods. The trail was familiar again, and I picked up my pace, anxious to finish the hike. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged from the woods, greeted by the sight of the parking lot. My car was still there, just as I had left it. I sat in my car for a long time, catching my breath, my heart still racing. I was finally safe. I didn't know how long I had been lost, but it felt like a lifetime. The experience had shaken me, and I knew that I would never take the woods for granted again. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to something much worse. How easy it would have been for things to have gone wrong. But I had made it out, and for that I was grateful. From that day forward, I always made sure to plan my hikes more carefully. I never went anywhere without telling someone where I was going, and I always carried extra supplies, just in case. I learned that no matter how well you think you know an area, the woods can change in an instant, and getting lost can happen to anyone. I never thought I'd get lost in the woods. I've always been someone who enjoys the outdoors, and I've hiked through countless trails, familiar with the signs and sounds of nature. But today, everything went wrong. Started out like any other hike. I had a plan: follow the marked trail, enjoy the fresh air, and take some pictures along the way. The sun was out, and there was a slight breeze, perfect hiking weather. I had packed my essentials: water, snacks, a map, and my phone for photos. I had been on this trail before, and I figured it would be an easy, relaxing day in the woods. But the further I went, the more I started to realize something was off. It wasn't the trail or the weather. It wasn't even the fact that I didn't see many other people. It was the silence. The woods seemed too quiet. Usually, there's some sort of noise, a rustling of leaves, birds calling, insects buzzing. But today there was nothing, just stillness. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the time of day, the quiet before the evening rush of animals preparing for nightfall. I told myself I'd be fine. I've hiked alone before. I was confident, but then I made a mistake. I decided to leave the main path for a bit just to explore. There was a small, unmarked trail I noticed, hidden behind some thick bushes. It looked like it would lead somewhere interesting, so I stepped off the main path. Big mistake. I didn't realize at the time how easily I could lose my bearings. I thought I was just taking a small detour, but soon, the trail started to fade. The trees were thicker here, and I couldn't see much of the sky above. I tried to keep track of landmarks, marking trees in my mind as I walked, but the deeper I went, the more everything started to look the same. At first, I wasn't worried. It was just a little detour after all. But then, after what felt like an hour, I looked around and realized I didn't recognize anything. I couldn't see the trail behind me. The trees had closed in, and everything was a blur of green and brown. I stopped, my heart starting to race. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check the map. No signal. Of course, no signal. That's when it hit me, seriously hit me, that I was lost. I tried to stay calm. I had enough water, and I wasn't in immediate danger. I started retracing my steps, but every direction I went seemed to bring me deeper into the woods. The trees were like walls, blocking any chance of seeing the horizon. I had no idea which way to go. I could feel my pulse quicken. This wasn't supposed to happen. I checked my watch. It was past noon now, and I'd been out here for longer than I realized. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I needed to find my way out, not think about food. I started walking faster, hoping to stumble across a familiar landmark. But the woods had become a maze, and I was losing my sense of direction. Every time I thought I saw something, a break in the trees, a hill up ahead, I'd walk towards it, only to find myself at another dead end. I started feeling panicked, my chest tightening with every step. I had no idea how far I had walked or which direction I was heading. My phone had died, and I had no way to call for help. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I knew I didn't have much time before it would be too dark to see anything. The thought of spending the night out here made my stomach twist with dread. I kept moving. The woods were quieter now, the eerie stillness making my every step seem louder. The shadows grew longer, and my mind started to race, imagining all sorts of worst-case scenarios. Couldn't help it. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I had to keep moving, but my legs were getting heavy, and my body was starting to protest. I found a clearing. At least I thought it was a clearing. There was an area where the trees seemed to thin out, but when I stepped into it, I realized it was just a patch of tall grass and overgrown bushes. There was no path, no way out. I stood there for a moment trying to think, trying to force my brain to focus. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Felt like hours had passed. My legs were sore, and I had started to lose track of time. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the landscape. It would be dark soon, and I had no idea where I was. I needed to find shelter, at least for the night. I knew I couldn't keep walking around aimlessly. I had to stop and figure something out. The woods were turning colder, and the last thing I needed was to get hypothermia in the middle of nowhere. I spotted a large rock formation nearby. It wasn't much, but I could take shelter there for the night, at least until I figured out what to do next. I moved towards it, my steps sluggish but determined. As I got closer to the rocks, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a faint trail. It wasn't much, just a line of broken branches and crushed leaves leading towards a slightly clearer path. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the way out? I cautiously followed the trail, each step more hopeful than the last. The trail was faint, but I could see it now, just enough to follow. I walked faster, adrenaline pushing me forward. The sun was setting, and I didn't have much time. Then suddenly the trees opened up, and I saw it. The main trail, the one I had started on. Couldn't believe it. I had found my way back. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the familiar path, feeling a rush of relief flood over me. I wasn't lost anymore. I was going to make it out. I walked quickly now, my steps lighter, the weight of panic finally lifting from my shoulders. The woods didn't feel as threatening now. The sounds of the forest returned, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds in the distance. I wasn't alone anymore. The trees didn't feel like walls. They felt like guides, leading me home. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the stars had started to appear in the sky. I stepped out of the trees and onto a gravel road that led back to the parking lot. I looked up at the sky, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. I had made it out. I had no idea how long I had been lost. Hours, maybe more. But I was safe. The woods were beautiful, but they could be unforgiving. I knew I'd be back, but next time, I'd be more prepared. I'd stick to the path, and I'd never take the forest's quiet for granted again. The day started off like any other hiking trip. The sun was out, there was a slight breeze, and I felt energized. I had set out on my own, hoping to spend the day in the woods, away from the noise and distractions of the city. I knew the trail well enough. It was one I had hiked many times before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the strange feeling in the air or how quiet it seemed, even for the woods. I had parked at the base of the mountain, and after double-checking my gear, I started walking down the familiar path. The trees above me blocked out most of the sunlight, and the air was cool and fresh. The crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots was the only sound I could hear, and I began to lose myself in the peaceful rhythm of walking. The first couple of hours went by uneventfully. I stopped at my usual spots to take a break and drink some water. There was something soothing about the isolation. It was just me, the trees, and the winding trail that I knew like the back of my hand. But as I pressed on, things began to change. The trail, which normally felt like a well-worn path, started to get uneven. I noticed that the trail markers were fewer, and the path itself felt less defined. The quietness that had felt peaceful at first now felt oppressive, like the air had thickened around me. First, I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I realized something. I didn't recognize this part of the forest. I had hiked in these woods before, and yet something was off. The trees, the slope of the land, it didn't feel like I was where I thought I was. I stopped and looked around, trying to orient myself. There were no trail markers in sight, and the underbrush around me had grown dense. I turned around and started walking back, but after a few minutes, I realized I hadn't seen anything familiar. The trail that had been so clear before was now completely gone. My heart started to race. I had a map, but I'd left it in the car, thinking I wouldn't need it on a trail I knew so well. Now, the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. I was lost. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I had been in the woods before and knew how to get out. I would retrace my steps, find the trail again, and head back to the car. But after what felt like hours of walking, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly in all directions. No familiar landmarks, no trail markers, nothing. It was just trees and thick underbrush. I checked my watch, it was just past noon. I thought about making a call, but I had no signal. I couldn't even see a clear path to try and find higher ground to get better reception. I started walking again, moving more carefully now, paying attention to every detail. The sounds of the forest had changed too. What had once been a peaceful hum of birds and distant rustling was now eerily quiet. It felt like everything around me had gone still, holding its breath. The woods were thick, and the sun was now starting to dip below the canopy. Shadows grew longer, and I could feel the temperature beginning to drop. My stomach started to churn. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, and the nervousness from being lost was making me feel queasy. I thought about stopping to rest, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The idea of sitting still in a place I didn't recognize with no clear path back made my skin crawl. So I pushed on, hoping to find something, anything that would help me orient myself. I tried to stay calm, thinking back to everything I had read about survival in the woods. Stay calm, find shelter if necessary, and always keep moving. As the hours passed, I felt my sense of time slip away. The woods around me looked the same, just endless trees, the occasional rock, and the thick carpet of leaves and moss. The daylight was fading fast, and the temperature dropped further. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my body. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping to spot a landmark or trail marker soon. But nothing came. The forest just stretched on, its endless green layers slowly darkening as the sun set. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and an oppressive silence settled over everything. The only sounds now were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. I checked my phone again, hoping for a signal, but there was still nothing. It was then that I began to feel the first real pangs of panic. I had read all the survival tips. Don't panic, stay calm, and conserve your energy. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a creeping sense of dread that started to settle over me. The trees were closing in. The path I had once known so well now felt like it was slipping away from me. The quiet had turned into a heavy, suffocating silence. I could hear my own breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and that was it. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no sounds of wildlife. Just me alone in the woods. I thought about trying to make a fire, but I didn't have anything to start one. I didn't even have a flashlight. I had planned on only being out for a few hours, and I hadn't packed anything beyond the basics. I stopped walking and sat down on a large rock. My head was spinning, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I needed to think clearly. If I stayed calm, I could figure this out. But how? My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, trying to remember the basics of navigation. Should I try to head east? West? I wasn't sure which direction I had been walking in, and the forest around me looked identical in every direction. The map I'd left in the car wasn't going to help me now. My phone was useless. I felt utterly alone. As the hours wore on, the forest darkened completely. I knew I couldn't keep walking through the night, not without any clear sense of where I was going. My best chance of survival now was to find somewhere safe to spend the night and wait until morning. I started looking for a place to shelter, hoping for some kind of natural protection from the elements. A cave, a rock overhang, anything. After what seemed like an eternity of searching, I found a small clearing and decided to stop. There was a fallen tree that provided some shelter from the wind, and I gathered some leaves and branches to make a crude bed. I wrapped my jacket around myself as best I could and tried to settle in, but sleep wouldn't come. The night was silent and cold, and I could feel the fear creeping back in every time I closed my eyes. I spent the night shivering in the clearing, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting me on edge. It felt like hours before the first light of morning broke through the trees. I forced myself to get up, hoping that with the dawn, I would have better luck. The first thing I noticed when the sun came up was the sharpness of the air. The woods seemed less oppressive now, and the morning light gave everything a different perspective. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. It was time to make one last effort to get out.